Right, good morning everybody. Welcome to our webinar this morning around GDPR. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to obviously find out a little bit more about this subject, and hopefully we're going to give you some information that you can act on. Obviously with now almost 2 months to go until GDPR comes into force, it's more important than ever to make sure that you understand it and really that you've got a bit of an action plan around what you want to do. So in terms of introductions, just firstly, you can see two logos on screen here, HPP Systems and Cameron Computers. Some of you may have signed up through either of those companies. Just so you're aware, we are sister companies. We work very closely together, and all of the information we're going to give you today applies equally regardless of which company you signed up from. My name's Phil Denham, so I'm the commercial director here at HPP Systems. So I come at this very much from a user's point of view. So I'm not a technical person. We will do a little bit around some of the technical elements later on, but certainly nothing too in depth. And hopefully what I can do is give you what I believe is a very common sense approach to GDPR, to try and understand what's going on with it and make sensible decisions and sensible steps on how you get yourself ready for it, basically. Just a little one in terms of the housekeeping around the webinar. If you have any questions, there should be a little questions box in your GoToWebinar widget. Feel free to pop any of the questions that you've got in there. Just the way that my screens are set up, I don't tend to see them as they come in through the session. So I will pick them all up at the end. So you can either save your questions to the end and I'll stick around and answer as many of them as I possibly can at the end, or pop them in as you go along. If I do manage to spot them and they're relevant, I'll try and answer them as I go along. Okay, let's get started. Right, so first and foremost, I do have to start with a bit of a disclaimer. Obviously, what we're going to talk about today is a piece of legislation. I do not have a legal background. Both HPP and Cameron are not legal companies. So we do want to make that clear that the information we're going to give you today, it is opinion. It is our view on GDPR, our understanding of it. If at the end of this you don't feel confident that you need to go, that you can go ahead by yourself and you want some kind of legal backup on that, then obviously we would advise you to speak to somebody from a legal background. Hopefully you won't need that, and that isn't the direction I want to push you in any means whatsoever. And like I say, I think we can take a very common sense approach to this. Okay, so let's just start right at the beginning. GDPR, it's a General Data Protection Regulation. It's also been known as, it's been developed as the EU Data Protection Regulation, which means it is an EU piece of legislation. But obviously with us leaving the EU, this will come into force in the UK in virtually exactly the same position. So there may be a few very minor tweaks around a few things that probably won't affect most of us. So this will come into effect even when we leave the EU. So it will come into play in the UK in May 2018. That's the same for the vast majority of the EU. A few of the member states have decided to adopt it early, but pretty much everyone is adopting it then. And it takes over from laws that were put in place back in 1998. So this is quite overdue. Obviously, if you think how much the world has changed in these past 20 years around technology and how many people hold our data and what they can do with that data, this is a piece of legislation that really was needed. And it was actually launched, almost 2 years ago now, back in May 2016, giving us all a 2-year transition period to get ready for it. So the idea isn't that it comes in May this year and then all of a sudden we start panicking and scrambling and doing stuff about it. Actually, it was announced 2 years ago to give us that time to get ready for things. And obviously we are now in virtually in the last 2 months of that time period to make sure it's ready, to make sure we're ready. Now, this is my end of the world slide. This is the type of thing I believe you see out there on a regular basis when it comes to GDPR, certainly on places like LinkedIn. I've been on this morning already since my scaremongering. There's plenty of it out there in the news as well, whether that's news stories saying people have never heard of GDPR, they don't know what they're doing with it, or quite often talking about the fines, and I'll cover the fines very shortly. So there's a lot of this scaremongering and that no one's ready and everyone's kind of going to go out of business because of what's coming on. Well, I think the key to this is really understanding what I call the spirit of GDPR. And the spirit of GDPR is all about personal data and having a responsibility to look after it. And if you think about, come out of your business mind for a second and into your consumer life, all of the companies out there that hold information on you. I mean, in the last 6 months, I think I've changed my house insurance, my mortgage, my car insurance, and various other things along the way, just to the ones that I've updated recently. So there's all these businesses out there, and I have an expectation that those businesses look after that data, that they use it in the manner it was intended for. And really, that's what the spirit of GDPR is. Those companies having a responsibility for my data and looking after it and treating it in the way that I would expect. So GDPR in a nutshell is about protecting individuals' data. And GDPR basically says this has to be personally identifiable information, which is normally, not always, but normally 2 pieces of information. For example, my name and my phone number that would go together and say that would definitely be me, for example. And obviously any additional information around that could help identify who I was. It covers 2 areas, so the processing and management of data. GDPR uses the word processing a lot, and what they mean by this is using it. So whether that's for marketing, for customer service purposes, for renewals of contracts, for anything like that, basically anything we're using that data to carry out in action, that's covering processing. And the second one is then about the protection of data. So the idea that we are storing this data either on our IT network or on a third-party piece of software that we've chosen to use, and have we taken responsibility to protect that and making sure that it's safe. And it's also really important to point out that this is similar to the DPA. The DPA is the Data Protection Act 1998, so it's been in place, like I say, for almost 20 years. The essence of the DPA, which of course we are all currently abiding by, and no one is worried about and no one's panicking about the DPA, is not too dissimilar to what we've got when it comes to GDPR, which is really important to understand that this isn't just come out of nowhere. This is an upgrade from what we've already got. Now, I mentioned the fines, and the big thing that's hit the news is these increasing fines. And I'll just give you an example of where we were in the last sort of couple of years. You probably all remember TalkTalk being hacked and having a huge amount of customer data leaked online. They were fined initially for that data breach £100,000 and given a set of guidelines to follow in order to improve things. When things didn't improve, they were fined a further £400,000, taking their fine to the maximum £500,000 as it stands right now under the DPA. Under GDPR, those fines are going to go up, and you've probably seen these headlines, but it's 20 million euros, which is around about 17 million pounds, or 4% of your global turnover, whichever is larger. Obviously, that final line generally aimed at really big businesses. But what we're seeing here is that increase from £500,000 to 17 million or 20 million euros is going to do 2 things. Firstly, it's going to act as a huge deterrent because it's been very heavily publicised, that fine. So we all now know that there's these big potential fines out there if we do something wrong. So it is intended to act as a deterrent, but also it's proportionate then for the size of company. If you think a company the size of TalkTalk and all the others that have been hacked, the Sonys, the Domino's, and all of these people, £500,000 is not a huge fine for a business of that size. But bringing that up to that 20 million euro threshold and also the 4% of global turnover means that there's some real clout then. It's also important to point out this is being carried out by an organisation called the ICO. So the ICO already regulate the Data Protection Act, and they will then regulate GDPR. So it's the same organisation that's going to be looking after this, dishing out the fines, looking into investigations and things like that. So it's giving that organisation a lot more clout when it comes to punishing people that they think have done wrong. And I mentioned there's 2 sides of this, and this is a pretty appalling screenshot, I give you that. But this is a screenshot from a Manchester United football match. If you are a football fan, you will have seen this, I'm sure. Man United have been heavily advertising this idea that you need to opt in again to receive emails from them. We've also seen in the news Wetherspoons, the pub and restaurant chain, who have said they're actually deleting their whole customer database and starting again because of GDPR. So what we're seeing is some really high profile brands put this right in the spotlight about managing data and how we need to do that. And what they're doing is they're taking a really, really hardline approach. And by no means am I saying that's wrong. But what I always say when it comes to cybersecurity and big brands is that you can't treat yourself like a big brand if you're not like one. You need to adapt to this and say, how does this apply to my business? And what can I do to make sure that I comply within kind of the necessary limits of who I am, the type of data I hold, and what I do with that. But this has really brought it to the spotlight recently, certainly probably in the last 3 months. Even though we've had 2 years to get ready, the last 3 months, some real big brands really pushing GDPR to the forefront when it comes to managing data. Having said that, the big driver behind GDPR, when this first was sort of talked about, was not really around how we process data. That's come along the journey. The real kind of driver behind this was around loss of data. So some of these big brands that I've mentioned that are losing our data, not looking after it, it's ending up in the public domain. That means our usernames, our passwords are potentially being lost, or even more sensitive data that's getting out there. And GDPR was really designed to update the laws that were outdated because of changes in technology, and more importantly, because of changes in cybercrime as well. And I will come on to that specifically later. But what this slide shows, this is actually from 2016. The 2017 stats aren't quite ready yet, although they are going to look virtually the same, if I'm honest. Is the types of data loss and where they came from. So what we see here is 57% of the data breaches reported to the ICO in 2016 were down to hacking or malware. If you're not familiar with the term malware, it's basically a shortened version of malicious software. So viruses, any kind of piece of software that's designed to do damage, steal money, cause disruption, anything like that. So a huge amount of that comes from there. We also have unintended disclosure. So this is the sort of thing where people send stuff to people by mistake, or it falls into the wrong hands. A typical example would be when somebody sends something to the wrong person by email. If it's internal, if you've got anyone in your business that's got the same name as you, you might be familiar with this, which might not cause a problem internally, but if that happens externally, that can be considered a data breach straight away. We also have portable devices, so the loss of or theft of mobile phones, tablets, laptops, etc. And then physical loss as well. So this could be notebooks or printed out paperwork or anything like that. And what's important to understand is there's actually a huge amount we can do to protect against this, which is what GDPR is driving us towards. So of course, hacking or malware is all about software. It's about processes, in some cases about training staff as well, but a huge amount we can put in place to really limit those risks. Even from an unintended disclosure point of view, I think training absolutely comes into that. So it's front of mind for people. They understand their responsibilities as members of staff when it comes to data protection. But even to the point, if that's a real risk potentially for your business, you are sending sensitive data from one place to another, then you can look at forms of encryption around that data to make sure that only the people that it's intended for can actually open those. Portable devices, again, although you might not be able to stop people losing them or having them stolen, what you can do is you can use encryption to make sure they can't be used by people that you don't want them to, have systems in place where they can be remotely wiped, for example. And even when it comes to physical loss, again, you might not be able to stop people losing that stuff and things like that, but what you can do is limit what, for example, can be printed out of your network. So if you don't want people to print customer lists or customer information out of your network, you can limit that sort of thing right from the get-go, so that actually that risk is reduced straight away. So this is very much in our hands of what we can do. And the title of our webinar today, and indeed a lot of the marketing we've been doing to try and make people aware of this, is are you ready? Which is the question we think people need to ask themselves. Now this does range, but this is my opinion of people that I've spoke to, in that they're at least halfway there, if not all the way there. They're somewhere in the middle. What they aren't, and I don't think I've spoken to any business at all who is less than halfway there, i.e. even the ones that don't understand it, have never heard of it, and all of that, are at least some of the way there. The fact that we have an act in place now that's not too dissimilar helps with that. But most importantly, a lot of this is good business practice. If you're not looking after your data in terms of protecting it and stopping yourself getting hacked, that is not very good business practice, and you're obviously going to suffer the consequences if you do get hacked from that, regardless of GDPR. And also, when it comes to looking after customer data, it makes sense to use that in the scenarios I mentioned, in that if I've given my data to a house insurance company, they use it to process my house insurance inquiries. They don't pass that off to a different part of their business and start sending me stuff from there. So it does make a lot of sense from a business point of view anyway. The reason why there is a bit of a span in there, I suppose, between 50 and 90%, is often the ones that are halfway there are normally the ones who are in some sort of IT rotation process, and actually they know they need to update, they know they need to upgrade their servers or their antivirus software or any of that, and it's on the plan. Effectively, that's part of the thing they're doing to get ready for GDPR. So hopefully, as we get past these last couple of months, we should see a lot more business around sort of the 80 to 90% sort of region at worst. So one of the big questions I get asked is the what if. So what if I do get hacked? What happens? How am I going to get fined if indeed I am going to get fined? So just to give you a basic understanding of what happens there. If you do suffer a data breach, and as I've mentioned, there's various different ways you could suffer that data breach, but let's stick with something like a hack. So your system is compromised, data is stolen, then you effectively need to report yourself to the ICO there. Now, there are some stipulations over what is required to report yourself, but a vast majority of hacks and breaches in that way would result in you needing to self-report. So you'd need to report the quantity of data, the type of data, how it happened, and any measures that you've already taken or proposed to take to stop that exact same thing happening again. You would also then, whilst you're in the spotlight, need to prove to the ICO, who are the governing body, as I mentioned, that you have taken necessary measures to protect your data across your business. So not just the area where it happened, but across everything. So your processes, any specific policies that you've got, and then you would also need to do the same thing for your data protection. Say, this is the level of protection we've put in place. This is why we feel it's necessary and that we've taken the appropriate steps. And in the scenario that we've just had, this is what slipped through the net effectively, and this is what we're doing to stop that happening again. Now, there are absolutely no guarantees of fines. So you do have this opportunity effectively to defend yourself, which is where really you can play on this idea of GDPR talking about necessary measures. You need to identify in your business what are the necessary measures to protect your data, to keep it safe, and to use it in the kind of lawful and expected way. Once you understand that, you take the necessary measures to go with it. The sort of examples I'm talking about there is if you hold data on people and it's just, for example, their email address and their name, then the expectations of you would by definition be very different than if you were holding medical records or criminal records or something incredibly sensitive about that person. So and as a consumer, again, you would have different expectations, of course. If people hold that different level of information on you, you would expect them to take different measures. It will also impact, of course, on your size of the business, which will obviously impact on things like budgets and how much you can physically spend to protect this data. And it will also come into processes as well to say, how do we do this? Have we told our staff? Have we communicated this to make sure this all happens? So ultimately, what you need to get to is this position where if someone ever questioned you, you were confident to say, we have taken the necessary measures to protect our data, and we're respecting those rights of those individuals when it comes to looking after their data. Okay, so let's get on to some of the details. So this is the data processing side. So as I mentioned, this is how we use the data. Now, chances are you've come to this webinar for one of three reasons, probably. One, because you're worried about data processing, which is to do with your marketing, your customer database, and everything that goes with that. Or you're worried about your IT security. Or third, you're worried about both and you want to know all the information. But data processing is one that's certainly becoming more and more prevalent in the conversations that I've been having. Firstly, this makes it a business issue. So when GDPR first was announced, everyone went, right, that's an IT thing, pass that to the IT team. It's now realized that, you know what, this involves a lot more people within the business. And if there are any costs involved in sorting out your business from a GDPR point of view around data processing, it really is going to be time. It's going to be making the decision on the approach you take and then deploying that internally within your business. But like I say, it's very much a business issue. Now, I think I mentioned at the beginning, obviously, we're an IT company, so our specialism does lie on the IT and the cybersecurity side of things. But my role in particular, I do look after the sales and marketing side of the businesses at HBP and Cameron. So I'm going to come at this from the angle that I'm looking at things and from my opinion, which hopefully will give you kind of the ideas of where you need to go. There are a huge amount of grey areas in this, though, which I'm going to touch on a lot. So let's start, before we get to the grey area, the real kind of obvious stuff, the things that you might have seen if you've done any reading on GDPR up to now. So we take the first two. We've got the right for erasure and the right for portability. What this is doing is it's trying to make companies more responsible in terms of requests from end users, from the people who have their data held. So for example, if I moved my service from one business to another, let's assume I'm moving my broadband. So I move from BT, let's say, to Sky. I might think to myself, do you know what? There's no reason now why BT need my data. If they were to suffer a data breach, I don't really want to be caught up in that. So I might say to BT, I want to exercise my right for erasure, also known as the right to be forgotten. I'd like you to remove me from your database completely, and they are expected to comply with that. Likewise, if there's any information that I need to transfer from one organization to another because I'm moving, the right for portability effectively means that I own that data and I can request for that to be moved in a nice, simple and easy way. And again, the businesses are expected to comply with that under GDPR. The bottom two, explicit consent and removal of consent, are very much aimed at, if you like, marketing and customer service and the sort of contact we have with people on a regular basis. So explicit consent focuses quite heavily around email in the wording that it uses. So for example, if you're going through a shopping cart kind of process and you get to the bottom and there's normally 1 or 2 or 3 tick boxes at the bottom with a bit of blurb. Sometimes they're pre-ticked, sometimes they're not ticked, and you have to read it carefully to know what you're meant to do if you do or don't want to receive any further information. So what GDPR is saying is that this needs to be explicit consent, i.e. it needs to be an empty box that you tick to say, yes, I want something. And it also actually needs to be a double opt-in process. And that normally is carried out by the idea of you've ticked that box and then you get an email saying, can you confirm that you want to receive it? So it's really pushing us down this hardline approach to consent. What that also means, if you like, on the hard line of GDPR, is that any data that you currently hold that doesn't comply with this explicit consent is not GDPR compliant. So if you've had pre-tick boxes in the past, or you've had it hidden away in terms and conditions, or you've never even asked for consent, for example, then that won't comply with GDPR. The hardline approach to fixing that is to reconsent those people. So effectively to send things out and say, you need to opt in again, like the Manchester United example we gave earlier. Or you could even go down the Wetherspoons approach and say, do you know, we're going to delete it, or we're just going to start again and try and get all those people. That's the very hardline approach. With that as well, we then have this easy removal of consents, the idea that if you have given your consent, it's just as easy to get rid of it as it was to give it in the first place. No long questionnaires or having to phone up. It should be exactly the same process, or as close to as possible when it comes to removing. Now, I already know that by saying what I've said there, everyone's thinking, how on earth do I do this in my business? And this is really where this opinion piece comes in now. And obviously I put my little C disclaimer here, because I genuinely believe that this is then a commercial decision around how far you go with this, what the risks are, and actually whether or not, if anything, you can find a way that your approach does fit with GDPR legally. So I believe you have to kind of sit on one side of these benches, either the Wetherspoons and Manchester United route with your angel wings on and say, we are going to go absolutely hardline GDPR, which will depend on the marketing that you do, the type of data that you've got, and all of those sort of things. Or you need to put your little devil horns on and kind of say, right, can I find a way that this still can work for me, or that I need to adapt a little bit to push forward? I'm just going to direct you something very quickly here that really does open up this grey area. And it's a line that's on the ICO website. So the ICO being that governing body, they have a section around consent. Now, I will give out the link for this at the end of the slides, but if you want to have a look at it and verify what I'm saying or read some more, just search for ICO and GDPR. You'll get to the page. It's a great website, loads of really good information. And on the left-hand side, there's an area around consent. And the first line on that page says this: the GDPR sets a high standard for consent, but you often won't need consent. If consent is difficult, look for a different lawful basis. Now, there are a number of other lawful bases that you can effectively get consent from. One of them being something like a contract. So if you're in a contract with a customer, then you are expected to communicate with them in one way or another, for example. Another one which is really interesting is something called legitimate interest. Now, legitimate interest is probably the vaguest version of consent that you can find under GDPR. And what it is effectively saying, as the name suggests, is that the interests of both parties are kind of weighed up. So we think that actually by us speaking to that person or communicating about this thing, they would potentially be interested in it, and it would make sense for that to happen. What that means is that you are really starting to push yourself over onto this devilly side of things by trying to interpret GDPR and say, this is the approach we're going to go. The reason I go down this route is twofold. I've had a lot of conversations with people that have said things like, the best example I've had, somebody said to me, I have a database of 8,000 people. I send them a catalogue throughout the year. So whenever I update my catalogue, I send it out. It is absolutely vital to my business in terms of generating sales. I've not got consent for all of that. Should I go and re-consent all of those people in order to keep sending my catalogue? And realistically, the decision that person has is that if they re-consent, chances are, if you look at sort of standard marketing responses, if they got 10% to kind of not only open that email or that letter or what it was and then action it, that would probably be pretty good. Obviously, it's going to depend on how much they value the end content, but that would probably be a pretty good response, meaning that he is going to lose 90% of his audience overnight, which he's telling me is key. Or he continues to do what he does. He can obviously look and decide whether or not that fits into something like legitimate consent, but that's going to continue to drive his business. If you can imagine that was your absolute key driver, dropping that down 90% could ultimately mean the end of the business in that scenario. So that is a real commercial decision to be made. I really want you to go and read that area on the ICO website around consent, and that is going to really give you some guidance over where you decide to sit on this bench. What Wetherspoons are doing, what Manchester United are doing, I actually think is great. What they're doing is they're focusing on quality when it comes to marketing. So they're saying, do you know what? Wetherspoons said, we haven't really done email marketing very well. We've never really looked after these customers. Actually, we've never really asked them what they wanted. We're going to start again and do it brilliantly. And Manchester United have gone back and said, do you know what? You might be on the list, but if you really want to keep receiving our stuff, come and tell us. And do you know what? The people that do will be the real high quality stuff that are going to buy stuff from them, go to matches, buy merchandise and all of that. So there is a great argument on that side of things. But of course, if you're selling things like beer and football, then you do have potentially a very different audience than if you're selling stuff out of a catalogue in that scenario, whatever those products would be. I hope that gives you an idea. I know there's questions on that, so feel free to fire through questions, and I'll do my absolute best to answer them. There is grey areas, I'm sure you've seen, but the ICO website will give you more around that side of things to nail it down. They've also got great things on there, for example, like example policies, example privacy policies and stuff like that, that can help you build in any of your own paperwork if you feel that's necessary. Okay, so let's move on to the other side of things. Now, luckily, the cybersecurity side is much more black and white. I've already talked about how the fact that things have changed over the last 20 years. Now, this is a little bit of a longer graph. So as you look at your screen over on your left, 1984 going across to 2017. This is the different strains of malware that have been detected by a company called AV Test over that period of time. And you see the absolute huge rise from really around sort of the mid-2000s up to present day. And there's two things that have really driven that. The first one being that cybersecurity's got better. So when people write stuff now and it gets blocked, they have to go back and they have to write something else a bit more complex and a bit better. But the real key one is monetization. The fact that people are making money out of cybercrime now. It's been in the news recently, obviously, with Russia and the fact that Russia don't really crack down on this. They aren't alone. There are lots of countries out there where this is not regulated and effectively is organized crime, but ultimately a business as well. And what we see is that it makes money. If you look at the average wage of cyber criminals in any of these countries, quite often it's 10 times the sort of national average. It's been made very easy. I mean, the fact that we've all had all this time to get ready for GDPR and the vast majority of businesses have really done something about it in the last 6 months just shows that our attitude towards cybersecurity in the past has not always been where it should be. And it's also very hard to trace. These people are not idiots. They're very, very clever people writing this software. They understand that part of their job when writing the malware and things like that is that it's very hard to trace. On top of that as well, it's also very hard to stop. I mean, cross-border prosecution is not something that really takes place. So even if we could identify that person in, I'm sticking with Russia for now just because it's in the news, but that person in Russia that's hacked our system, the chances of obviously getting that person prosecuted are virtually nil. It's not going to happen, which means not only is it hard to trace, but it's also very hard to stop. Now, going on from there around cybersecurity, this might seem a bit strange to have a slide called Forget GDPR in the middle of a GDPR webinar, but we've been carrying out cybersecurity presentations now for probably the best part of 4 years. And if I'm honest, GDPR hasn't massively changed our advice. The advice that we give around being hacked and losing data is pretty much the same, with just that added level and that added complexity that GDPR brings to it. So let's assume in this scenario that our business has been hacked. And let's go with something that's quite common nowadays, something called ransomware. So if you aren't familiar with ransomware, this is where a piece of software gets onto your network, possibly because somebody's opened an email, clicked on an attachment, and that piece of software has been given the permission to run on that PC. That PC then finds its way around to the other things on your network, like your servers, and it encrypts all the data that's on there. So it scrambles it all up effectively and puts a really strong, complex password on there called an encryption key. And in order to get that encryption key, you have to pay a ransom, effectively. Those ransoms can range from anything from 500 quid, £1,000, to, in the worst case scenario that we've seen, £50,000. There are bigger ones out there, but firsthand, that is what we've seen. So when that happens, the first thing really to consider is the top two: your reputation and the loss of data or downtime. Those things are going to affect your ability to work. So the fact that you can't get on your systems, you can't get to your customer data, you can't get to your prospecting data, you can't get to any of that information that you need, and people are still potentially phoning you up and you're going to have to tell them those things, means that your reputation is going to absolutely be affected by this. The fact that the loss of data and downtime, depending on how long that period of time is, could also directly impact that reputation, regardless of whether or not you tell them that you've been hacked, because you simply can't carry out your duty as a business. So really, really key straight away. It's also important to point out that most people might have an expectation of how long it would take to restore their system from something like backup, but actually it's never been tested, and they don't know for sure. And in some scenarios, if it's completely and utterly kind of gone and you haven't got backup and you have to start from scratch, it's like buying a new system again. So there's that timescale of ordering things and getting them installed and getting all set up and ready. So some of this time, this can be days rather than hours that it takes to get back up and running. The next one is ransom fees. As I mentioned, the worst case scenario we've seen is £50,000, but actually cyber criminals tend to set ransom fees at what they think they can get paid for. It's also a misconception in many cases that if you pay the fee, you don't always get your data back, although there have been some cases. In most scenarios, you do get your data back. There is honour amongst thieves in that scenario because, as I mentioned, they're really running a bit of a business. So if someone pays them, they need to kind of deliver on what they said they were going to deliver. So those kind of ransom fees are set at a level that are, yes, painful, but also affordable in order to get that data back quickly and easily. The fourth one on there is one that we're really seeing more and more now, and this is what we call commercial factors. So the idea that this is now coming up on things like tender documents, that suppliers and customers of yours will start requesting that they see that you have taken cybersecurity seriously. Now, this normally comes in the form of some sort of accreditation. There's two main ones, which are Cyber Essentials, which is a government accreditation, and ISO 27001, which is obviously an ISO accreditation. Now, what that enables someone to do is say, yes, there you go, there's the piece of paper that proves we take it seriously. It's the tick in the box when it comes to a tender document, and it's that confirmation to a supplier or a customer that you have taken it seriously. As a business here, we've had 2 of those in the last 6 months where people have come to us and said, that prove that you take it seriously internally as well. So we've been able to. We've had something like 20 customers and new businesses that we've worked with come to us and say that that is now happening in their supply chain as well. We actually heard a rumor, I haven't had this absolutely confirmed yet, that this came out from the NHS recently as well, that the NHS are now insisting that anyone supplies them has Cyber Essentials accreditation, which is pretty rich coming from the NHS, if we're going to be honest, isn't it, considering what happened with them? But you understand their logic in that actually a lot of people hold their data in third-party areas. And then we've got our GDPR fines. So, do you know what I mean? If we get all the way through this and then we're going to get fined by the ICO for breaking GDPR, we've had all of that other stuff to worry about anyway. And in our opinion, at HBP and Cameron, that should really be your priority, making sure that your business is running at all times, that you're not incurring costs from stupid things like ransom fees. And actually, from a commercial point of view, you're able to win new business and carry on dealing with the fantastic customers that I'm sure you've already got. So, don't get hacked. Ultimately, that is what GDPR is telling you to do. Do not get hacked. Do not get yourself in this position. It's a pretty straightforward message. But ultimately, what they're really kind of getting at is they're ensuring that you're confident you've taken all the measures you need to take so that you don't get hacked. Because things can happen. Do you know what I mean? This is an ever-evolving industry. And I mentioned earlier that people develop software because security software stops it happening, so they need to do something else and get around that and get around it and get around it. So it's always a game of cat and mouse when it comes to cybercrime and cybersecurity. So no one's saying that it won't happen, but you need to be confident that you've done everything you possibly can. In the scenario where you haven't done that and you get hacked, that is where you're absolutely going to fall foul around the ICO and around GDPR. What, of course, we don't know, and we really won't know until the 25th of May, is just how heavy-handed they'll be with this. No one knows for sure. I mean, the ICO have come out and said they're not looking to put people out of business when it comes to finding them, but they potentially are going to make some examples of people, is what we'd probably expect. How far down the line they go with that, we will generally have to wait and see, but it's almost a better safe than sorry approach here. Okay, so let me just go into, I mentioned we're going to a little bit of technical. Got about 10 minutes here of just sort of showing you from a cybersecurity sort of things, the types of things that you're looking to protect against. I mentioned earlier around data processing that your investment there is very much going to be around time. Obviously, when it comes to cybersecurity and software and things like that, there is an investment around cost, which as in money in terms of buying kit, buying software and implementing it. And quite often that sits in the background and you don't see that return on investment for it. So I think it's important to understand exactly what that's doing for you. So if we take some examples of how businesses get hacked at the moment, biggest one still to this day is the distribution of malware via email. So the idea that someone sends an email aimed to get to an end user, if there's some spam defense in there, it might get through it because it looks great, because that's, of course, the intention of the person who's written it, to get past spam defense. But there also might not be any spam defense in the first place that could have caught that. It gets that PC, and then the end user opens that, and they maybe open the Word documents in there and hit enable macros, for example, giving that software the ability to now run. Potentially there because they've had no staff training. They don't know what they're looking for. And as I mentioned, that's then going to use the permissions from that user to get onto things like the server and encrypt that data for ransom. And without the necessary protection on that server, maybe because it's outdated, there's an opportunity there for that to happen. So in a really quick sort of step, bang, 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 we could be in a position where our data is encrypted with ransomware. In a more technical area here, but not too technical, we have things like open ports on a router. So these could be used, for example, for web services. They could be used for things like remote workers. So not set up incredibly well. So there's potentially open router ports that can be seen and accessed if you know what you're looking for. And what that's going to do is that's going to give someone access effectively to see that router within your business. What could happen then is they could try to brute force the passwords through that router in order to get access onto your network again. Brute forcing, also known as dictionary attacks. So this is effectively trying a combination of usernames and passwords over and over again until it gets in. Again, if that's outdated or the passwords are particularly poor, that could get through again nice and easily. Again, using those permissions in this scenario that the router has to the network in order to get onto the server and again encrypt that data for ransom. So some really kind of quick stuff that goes on there to get right to the end, which you can see across the top there can be a combination of software, of processes, of training, and all of those sorts of things. So when it comes to this idea of GDPR and keeping your network safe and being confident, the sort of things you need to think about are And I start here very deliberately. Staff are quite often our biggest risk within our business. We can spend huge amounts of money on cybersecurity, put in all the processes and software we want. But if, for example, a staff member doesn't know how to set up a secure password, and they set up a password that's bananas123, for example, as opposed to something long, complex, using characters and things like this, then it can be hacked. And that means that that person who's hacked that account has now got all of the permissions and everything that that person had in the first place to carry out on your network. So it can be really bypassed if our staff aren't trained as part of this process. It's also important to point out around advanced antivirus, and I'm going to show you a little demo of this in a minute, but antivirus in its original format was all about signatures. So identifying effectively a big long list of things that were known to be risks. And then if it sees one of those risks, it stops it. It's a bit like if you were protecting a bank from a security point of view, having a big long list of all the bank robbers in the country and saying, don't let any of them in, as opposed to looking at the way the bank robbers rob banks. So if you go to cash points now, you see bollards in front of the cash points that stops people driving cars into those cash points. There will be CCTV, there will be vaults, there will be all these other things that have been done to look at the behavior. And that's what advanced antivirus is doing now. It's looking at things such as ransomware that rapidly encrypts files and saying, if I see that behavior, I'm not only going to stop it in its tracks, but I'm also going to be able to be clever enough to roll back the files that it's already encrypted to their original state, and to give me some reporting to say, where did that come from in the first place and what do we need to do to tighten up here? So it's some really clever stuff now that goes on with this software. Modern equipment is really key. So probably the most common example nowadays is people still using Microsoft XP machines. So things like XP are no longer supported by Microsoft. What that means in real terms is that they don't release security updates for it. So if somebody finds an exploit in Microsoft XP, Microsoft don't do anything about it. One exception to that was the exploit they found within the NHS when they did release an extra patch. But with that one exception, no other updates are being released for XP. You can roll that same concept out to your routers, to your server operating systems, and indeed any other pieces of software or hardware that has dedicated software on it throughout your network. So not only is it a case of updating things that aren't protected, but also about having a process of then patching them and keeping them up to date when these updates come out. From a GDPR point of view, it can be very sensible to have things like staff policies, so people understand your approach to cybersecurity, that they take it seriously as individuals as well. And what that will do is obviously it will build a culture within your organization to make sure that your whole kind of staff and your network is all in sync and aiming towards the same thing. Spam protection, which I think I showed in one of my examples. Web control, so this is the threats from websites and things like that. Quite often people think of that around the idea of blocking Facebook or porn or guns or anything like that. Actually, web control is much more sophisticated than that. It can identify a website that has been infected with something like malware and stop someone going on it from there. So it can be really clever. User access managed, so actually do all your staff need to get to everything on your network, for example, or people that need to get the finance information, just get to that bit of it, or could everyone get to that bit of it, for example? Also about clearing off old users as well. I had 2 friends who left a business and after 18 months could still log on to their network, hadn't been cleared down, no access removed, no passwords changed. So some really basic stuff sometimes to make sure you're safe in that respect. Data backup, so we talk a lot about backup within our organization. We think it's so key for everything you put in place. Your backup can be your absolute last line of defense. It can do the stupid stuff like when you accidentally delete a file, give you the opportunity to return that. But even outside of malware, obviously around disaster recovery, if you were to have a flood or a fire, data backup and having the process with that as well. So if you're using something like removable media, cartridges, or even backup tapes, having that rotation process where people are taking them off site, or using online backup services or a combination of the two. And then, of course, remote monitoring as well. So actually having this idea that somebody is watching this on a constant basis for you to identify any potential risks, any flaws within your system that could then cause problems. So it's all very well buying all this stuff, putting it in place, but then not looking at it and and not kind of seeing what's going, almost like the dashboard of your car. Consider it. It's like a warning light coming on that tells you that something's wrong. The last thing you want to do is wait for that thing to actually go wrong and you break down. If that warning light comes on, it gives you that opportunity to go and fix it. So very quickly, because I'm conscious of where I am with time, I just want to play you a little video here that shows some of this in practice. Now, we are a Sophos partner, so this is quite Sophos heavy, but please forgive the slightly, obviously, like sales angle on that because of it. But what this is showing is a user that's logged into their network. They've actually got encrypted files here, which is what it's showing. So these files are only accessible because this user is logged into the corporate network. They've also got advanced antivirus in place, which is all working fine, as we can see with a nice big green tick. And what we're just going to show here is this user can browse around the web. Obviously, we've seen that they can access their files already, but ultimately they've got full permissions to do everything you would expect a user to do. In the background of this as well, Sophos works on something called heartbeats, and what that means is that we have two in this scenario: the PC we're on and also the network we're talking to. And the fact that they've got two and they're green means that it's all working fine. So we're going to go and make this worse now. We're going to go and open up a dodgy email, this Word document here. It's going to ask us, do we want to enable the contract from these macros? And we're going to say yes. And what that's going to do immediately is run this piece of ransomware in the background, which Sophos, the antivirus, then is kicking in straight away, identifying that threat. And what that's done is it's now put our system in quarantine. So it's actually removed that heartbeat, that everything's working well, and said, no, there is a problem with this machine. Take it off the network effectively. So it's now removed all of our access, which means we can't access the internet. Really important from a ransomware point of view, because one of the first things ransomware will do is try to talk home to get that encryption key in order to block everything. We stop that through the web. And because we've got encryption on these files here, it's even blocking the access to our files. So virtually this machine is pretty useless now. We're going to go in, we're going to clean that up. Obviously, we have this happening very fast all on this same machine with all the access we've got. So we've got rid of it. So we've got a big green tick back. Our heartbeat comes back to life again, saying that we're healthy, and Sophos is happy for us to be talking to the rest of the network again, and therefore we get all of our permissions back around our network and our files. So you can see just how powerful this sort of stuff is in the background that's protecting you and all of your staff within your business. What it also gives us, as I mentioned earlier, is this opportunity to identify what went on when something goes on like this, and where did it start, and where do we potentially need to tighten up to stop these sort of things happening again in the future. So this visualization, there's various ways, but this visualization tool is very nice. You can see from the key just across the top there, we've got files, processes, registry keys, network connections, all the things that in a really short amount of time this virus attempted to do, the processes it tried to run, the files it tried to touch, any registry keys it tried to affect, any network connections it tried to make. And you can see here with this little red dot on the beacon events here where the Word document was opened, which is where it all originated in this scenario. And we can see straight away it reaching out these yellow dots here to these different IP addresses, potentially in order to talk home or even to infect other machines. So really powerful stuff when it comes to that software that sits in the background, the sort of thing that's going to keep you absolutely completely GDPR compliant in that respect. And what we're going for here is this what we call a layered approach to security. We talk about this in the concept of phishing nets. It's the idea that if you had one level of protection, it would be a phishing net over your business. You put another one on top at a slightly different angle, then the holes get smaller, and another one, another one, another one. Every single layer that you put on makes you safer and safer and safer effectively. So that's the approach that we recommend. That's how we recommend stay GDPR compliant from an IT security point of view. So your next steps, coming obviously to the end of the webinar now. So first and foremost, you need to review your data processing. It's very hard to give a one-size-fits-all approach to that. I hope you appreciate that from some of the information I've given you. More than happy to answer your specific questions at the end though. You also need to review your IT security and effectively make sure you're happy with those top two to say, if someone questions us, could we say, yes, we've done everything we possibly could. Speak to us. You're more than happy to speak to us from an IT security point of view in terms of obviously we're happy to come out and review your network, make recommendations and things like that. If you have questions specifically for me, I'm going to put my email up at the end. You are more than welcome to ask me any questions that you've got. And finally, I mentioned about reading more. If you want to go and do your own research, I'd strongly recommend the ICO's website. The link's there. We will send these around, obviously. But just search for the ICO, search for GDPR, and you will get to where you need to go. So I hope that has been useful. I know there's a couple of questions already ticked through, which I'll get straight to. But if you do have any more questions now, if you use your questions little section on your GoToWebinar widget, or if it's something that you prefer me not to answer, I won't mention anyone's names when I'm answering these questions on the webinar today, but it's something you'd like to have a proper discussion about, please feel free to email me. It's always nice if you put your phone number on there, because sometimes the answers are so much easier to be done verbally than they are written. So there's the options for questions. Let me have a look at what we've got in already and see what we can answer. By the way, if you need to get off, I'm just going to go through questions now. So if you do need to get off, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much. But you're obviously more than welcome to stick around. First question, is the DPA 1998 going to be repealed on the 25th, or will the legislation remain until the GDPR is implemented in the UK bill? No, it's overwriting it effectively. So GDPR will come in place. It's updating that legislation. So yeah, the DPA will be superseded by it. There's nothing in the DPA really that that isn't covered in GDPR and updated. The one thing I probably forgot to mention around there, in fact, I definitely forgot to mention, is this idea that actually if there are other pieces of legislations that exist that overwrite GDPR, they do recognise them. So for example, there are financial regulations where you have to keep information for a certain amount of time. GDPR recognises that. The most, if you like, extreme version is criminal records, medical records. You can't go to the police and exercise your right to be forgotten around a criminal record, for example. So yeah, GDPR's taken over from DPA, but it does recognise other legislations. Do I need to contact my customers regarding their emails to get their consent? I think I covered this. I'm not sure when this question came in, but just to reiterate, it depends really on where you sit on my bench, in that if you are Manchester United, as we gave that example, they are doing exactly that. They're contacting all of their customers and saying, if you want to continue to receive emails from us, in fact, any communication from us, then you have to consent again. So the hardline approach is that. The alternative to that is looking at the consent area on the ICO and seeing whether or not your approach to marketing falls into one of the other lawful areas of consent. Have a look at legitimate interest first. It's probably the most likely one that it would fit into, and then you can make a decision on exactly how hardline you go. Even the best of companies, the Manchester Uniteds and people like that, I wouldn't expect them to get more than I don't know, 30 to 50% reconsenting. I would have thought would be amazing for them. Just because people don't open emails and they don't action stuff, and we're all busy, just the nature of the beast. So you have to take that into consideration of what the fallout will be if you do decide to go down that route. How does this impact contacting cold leads? We sell products within the industrial food market, so would it still be okay to market potential new customers from something as simple as a Google search? Because I could Google restaurants and then use their email to promote our product. Is this frowned upon under GDPR when it's public domain information? The quick answer is yes, it is frowned upon, which may be quite a soft way to say that. GDPR is quite heavy on this idea of consent. There has to be if you like, a lawful reason for you to contact them. And a little bit, as I've just said there, legitimate interest might be your best way. And we've had this discussion internally around the idea that if you were to profile customers or potential new customers, so your cold leads there, and say, so you said you sell within the industrial food market. So you said, right, these are all the industries or the SIC codes, if you're familiar with SIC codes, that we deal with. I know that I deal with the operations managers or the buyers and the purchasing teams in that scenario. I am going to contact them because I believe there's a legitimate interest around what we're sending and what they're going to receive. Now, what you have to do around legitimate interest is balance that interest. You say, is there something in that for them, and is there something in that for us that actually weighs itself up? If it's all one way, i.e. spammy type stuff, then you're probably not even going to tick the legitimate interest box. GDPR is cracking down on cold leads, effectively, cold calling, on what it calls unsolicited mail. So it's a massive impact on that side of things. Depending on your industry, it really is a good time to review that marketing and say, does it work? Does cold calling work for you? Does cold emailing work for you? And actually, is this time to review that and say, do you know what? We get 15% open rates on our emails. We have to make 150 calls before we get an appointment. Is there a smarter way to do this? So it's a good time to review that. Out of the end of that, you will get your approach that you need to then say, does this fit into GDPR acceptably? Or, as I mentioned earlier with the example I gave, am I willing to take the risks associated with it? It might seem a bit silly for me to talk about the associated risks and almost telling you to go down a route that might be frowned upon. What I would say in response to that would be telephone preference service, TPS. I haven't met anyone so far in my conversations about GDPR who checks the TPS before they make a phone call. It's governed by the ICO, the same body that looks after GDPR, and the legislation, the approach is virtually the same. Do you know what I mean? If you effectively put yourself on the TPS, you're not expected to phone, but very few people see that as a risk and very few people follow it. Next question, can I tell what happens after Brexit? So I don't know, I assume you mean with GDPR. If you want me to go into anything else, I might struggle on that one. Who knows? But with regards to GDPR, so it will become a UK legislation, whatever the process they're going through with everything regarding laws. There's like various bills in place and all that. But ultimately, the only slight changes are around some of the younger ages, so where you're processing data. I might be wrong on this, but it's something like at the moment there's separate rules under GDPR for under 18s. There's talk of making that under 16s in the UK or something like that. But the vast majority, 99.9% of it, will stay exactly the same and will just become UK law. So no change there whatsoever. And unless there's any more tick in, I think that is all my questions. I hope that's answered them for the people that have asked the questions. If it hasn't, I know there's at least one, if not two, very specific ones in there about your business. I'd be more than happy to have a quick conversation with you over the phone to talk about exactly the type of marketing you're doing and at least give my opinion. I know we're an IT company, but I've worked in marketing for something like 15 years now, so I can at least give you my approach and my opinion on that if you did want it. Obviously, feel free to drop me an email if you think that would be helpful. More than happy to help. So it does genuinely look like all the questions. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Really appreciate your time, and have a lovely rest of your Thursday. Thank you very much.